Hey, how are you? Hope you're doing well. I'm going to read from this Leadership Northouse book. I'm going to be on page 29. How does the trait approach work? The trait approach is very different from the other approaches discussed in subsequent chapters because it focuses exclusively on the leader, not on the followers or the situation. This makes the trait approach theoretically more straightforward than other approaches. In essence, the trait approach is concerned with what traits leaders exhibit and who has these traits. The trait approach does not lay out a set of hypotheses or principles about what kind of leader is needed in a certain situation or what a leader should do given a particular set of circumstances. Instead, this approach emphasizes that having a leader with a certain set of traits is crucial to having effective leadership. It is a leader and the leader's traits that are central to the leadership process. The trait approach suggests that organizations will work better if the people in managerial positions have designated leadership profiles. To find the right people, it is common for the organizations to use trait assessment instruments. The assumption behind these procedures is that selecting the right people will increase organizational effectiveness. Organizations can specify the characteristics of traits that are important to them for particular positions and then use trait assessment measures to determine whether an individual fits their needs. The trait approach is also used for personal awareness and development. By analyzing their own traits, managers can gain an idea of their strengths and weaknesses and can get a feel for how others in the organization see them. A trait assessment can help managers determine whether they have the qualities to move up or to move to other positions in the company. A trait assessment gives individuals a clearer picture on who they are as leaders and how they fit into the organizational hierarchy. In areas where their traits are lacking, leaders can try to make change in what they do or where they work to increase their traits' potential impact. Near the end of this chapter, a leadership instrument is provided that you can use to assess your leadership traits. This instrument is typical of the kinds of assessments that companies use to evaluate individual leadership potential. As you would discover, by completing this instrument, trait measures are a good way to assess your own characteristics. Strengths, page 30. The trait approach has several identifiable strengths. First, the trait approach is intuitively appealing. It fits clearly with our notion that leaders are the individuals who are out front and leading the way in our society. The image in the popular press and community at large is that leaders are a special kind of people with gifts who can do extraordinary things. The trait approach is consistent with this perception because it is built on the premise that leaders are different and their differences reside in the special traits they possess. People have a need to see their leaders as gifted people, and the trait approach fulfills this need. A second strength of the trait approach is that it has a century of research to back it up. No other theory can boast of the breadth and depth of studies conducted on the trait approach. The strength and longevity of this line of research gives the trait approach a measure of credibility that other approaches lack. Out of this abundance of research has emerged a body of data that points to the important role of various traits in the leadership process. Another strength, more conceptual in nature, results from the way the trait approach highlights the leader's component in the leadership process. Leadership is composed of leaders, followers, and situations, but the trait approach is devoted to only the first of these, leaders. Although this is also a potential weakness, by focusing exclusively on the role of the leader in leadership, the trait approach has been able to provide us with a deeper and more intricate understanding of how the leader and the leader's traits are related to the leadership process. Last, the trait approach has given us some benchmarks for what we need to look for if we want to be leaders. It identifies what traits we should have and whether the traits we do have are the best traits for leadership. Based on the findings of this approach, trait assessment procedures can be used to offer invaluable information to supervisors and managers about their strengths and weaknesses and the ways to improve their overall leadership effectiveness. That's page 30, strengths. And we'll do criticisms too. Criticisms, page 30. In addition to its strengths, the trait approach has several weaknesses. First and foremost is the failure of the trait approach to delimit a definitive list of leadership traits. Although an enormous number of studies have been conducted over the past 100 years, the findings from these studies have been ambiguous and uncertain at times. Furthermore, the list of traits that has emerged appears endless. This is obvious from Table 2.1, which lists a multitude of traits. In fact, these are only a sample of the many leadership traits that were studied. Another criticism is that the trait approach has failed to take situations into account. As Stockdale in 1948 pointed out more than 60 years ago, it is difficult to isolate a set of traits that are characteristic of leaders without also factoring situational effects into the equation. People who possess certain traits that make them leaders in one situation may not be leaders in another situation. Some people may have the traits that help them emerge as leaders, but not the traits that allow them to maintain their leadership over time. In other words, the situation influences leadership. It is therefore difficult to identify a universal set of leadership traits in isolation from the context in which the leadership occurs. A third criticism derived from the prior to criticism is that this approach has resulted in highly subjective determinations of the most important leadership traits. Because the findings on traits have been so extensive and broad, there's been much subjective interpretation of the meaning of the data. This subjectivity is readily apparent in the many self-help practice-oriented management books. For example, one author might identify ambition and creativity as a crucial leadership trait. Another might identify empathy and calmness. In both cases, it is the author's subjective experience and observations that are the basis for the identified leadership traits. These books may be helpful to readers because they identify and describe important leadership traits, but the methods used to generate these lists of traits are weak. To respond to people's need for a set of definitive traits of leaders, authors have set forth lists of traits, even if the origins of these lists are not grounded in strong, reliable research. Research on traits can also be criticized for failing to look at traits in relationship to leadership outcomes. This research has emphasized the identification of traits, but has not addressed how leadership traits affect group members and their work. In trying to ascertain universal leadership traits, researchers have focused on a link between specific traits and leadership emergence, but they have not tried to link leader traits with other outcomes such as productivity or employee satisfaction. For example, trait research does not provide data on whether leaders who have high intelligence and strong integrity have better results than leaders without these traits. The trait approach is weak in describing how leaders' traits affect the outcomes of groups and teams in organizational settings. A final criticism of the trait approach is that it is not a useful approach for training and development for leadership. Even if definitive traits could be identified, teaching new traits is not an easy process because traits are not easily changed. For example, it is not reasonable to send managers to training programs to raise their IQ or to train them to become extroverted. The point is that traits are largely fixed psychological structures, and this limits the value of teaching and leadership training. That's criticisms. Criticisms, we'll finish there on page 31, all right? Strengths and criticisms. Page 31, chapter 2. See ya.